Hello and welcome to another whip-cracking and pork-chop snacking episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that uses the cursed power of the horrible night to dig up the graves of some of gaming's darkest development stories. And when you say dark periods of gaming, you can't help but think back to the various growing pains that Konami went through as the industry transitioned from 2D side-scrollers to the pointy power of polygons. While Hideo Kojima and his team were able to deftly navigate into the 3D world of Metal Gear Solid, many of Konami's other big franchises didn't fare quite as well. Contra, Frogger, Blades of Steel, and even an attempt at a big 3D fighting game. And when I say an attempt, I mean way more attempts than you'd think. One other franchise that also didn't transition smoothly, something I think most would agree on, was the legendary Castlevania series. And before you ask, yes, I covered its N64 debut a few years back. But around the exact same time frame as that game was released, Konami had another completely different 3D project in the works for Sega's ill-fated Dreamcast. But for various reasons, which we'll get into, it wound up sharing a very similar and even more ill-fated, fate. So grab your holy water, daggers, stopwatch, axe, cross, and whip as I answer the question, what happened to Castlevania Resurrection?
You like Castlevania, don't you?
While vampires have always been a major thorn in the side of many adventurers, you shouldn't discount the terror that can be brought about by other creatures of the night, namely the legendary beast of Gévaudan. And if you're as sick of the chaos and misery that furry fiend has been causing throughout the countryside as I am, then you should definitely check out Chronicles of the Wolf, the newly released gothic horror action title from Megami Games and P-Cube, where you're tasked with hunting down that beastly scourge through a massive interconnected world based on 18th century France. In Chronicles, you control Matteo Lombardo, the last disciple of the Rose Cross Order, who needs to traverse foreboding woods, dank caves, and yes, a very large castle in his quest to rid the land of this wolf forever, while also navigating a day and night cycle, uncovering secrets, new weapons, slaying massive bosses, and even earning multiple endings. In addition, offering over 10 hours of action during which Matteo also needs to upgrade his abilities and skills to stay alive, Chronicles of the Wolf also contains a variety of guest talent, like the voice of Alucard, Robert Belgrade, guest tracks by the composer of Lords of Shadow, and even an appearance by a familiar face from Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which all make for an authentic monster-slaying experience. So if you're interested in taking on the beast yourself, Chronicles of the Wolf is out now on Steam, Xbox Series, PS4, 5, and the Nintendo Switch. Thanks again to Megami Games and P-Cube for sponsoring today's video. And now, without further ado, let's usher in the horrible night. As previously stated, Konami's Dracula Slaying Simulator was at a bit of an impasse as the new 3D-capable consoles from Sony and Nintendo began taking over the market, with all of Konami's teams unsure on how to best proceed into the next generation. Despite strong reviews, Koji Igarashi's Symphony of the Night did perform well commercially on the original PlayStation, while Konami Kobe's Castlevania 64, yeah, I know that's not actually its official title, did the inverse, as it wasn't received very well critically. Konami didn't want to put all their eggs in two baskets though, so they were prepping for a third one, which turned out to be Sega's competing Dreamcast, which, as we know, burned brightly but very briefly. This choice made sense since it was the most powerful home console at the time, but with all of Konami's Japanese teams busy with other projects, they had to think outside the box to come up with a solution and a viable developer. Enter Konami Computer Entertainment Chicago. And yeah, that's not a typo or mistranslation, as Konami did in fact, for a very narrow band of time, have their own in-house American development studio, responsible for all these games you see here that you've also most likely never heard of. Okay, to be completely fair, I myself do recall seeing unreleased rented copies of Bottom of the Ninth in Blockbusters all the time, and Broken Helix and Project Overkill are also vaguely familiar. I just never realized they were all actually published by Konami. So not only is this a story about a forgotten Castlevania game, it's also the story of the first time a Castlevania game was developed outside of Japan, which, while interesting, isn't that big of an accomplishment considering, it wasn't actually finished or released. Still though, this pairing between the Belmont Legacy and Konami's Chicago team was their last and only real option if they wanted to make a good impression on Sega's 128-bit machine, as historically the console was absolutely bereft of Konami content. Outside of a few pop-in music titles and one singular Silent Scope, they really had nothing else to offer, as there was no Metal Gear or Contra, meaning all the pressure was put on Resurrection's shoulders to represent the company. What put even more pressure on the team, however, was the fact that Konami decided to open up a new studio in San Francisco mid-development and transfer certain employees from their main US branch in Chicago to the West Coast, while coordinating all of this from Japan, with only late 90s level of communication technology to help them. All of this, as you could surmise, would of course lead to a rather bumpy development pipeline, so it should be no surprise that the project's environmental artist, Jason Lee Elliott, on their own website in a very transparent black and white crystal clear statement said, "Castlevania Resurrection was a game doomed from the very start." Obviously, with two other flavors of Castlevania already either out there or in development for both the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, the Konami US team felt that they needed to do something a bit different in the hopes to stand out when it came to the characters and story. They went with a time-traveling plot, which at that point in the franchise history hadn't been tackled yet, and focused on two completely different playable Belmonts, with both being on the obscure side, which was especially true when it came to Sonia Belmont. But even more especially true when it came to Victor Belmont, a hero that, as of this writing, has never been made playable in any form whatsoever. Hey, Vampire Survivors devs, I know you included literally everybody else, but there's gotta be room for one more, yeah? So now that the scenario, setting, and characters were in place, with Victor rejecting the responsibility and mantle of his name, only to be ripped backwards in time in order to help his own, great-grandmother, I think, take down the Big D, Konami US just needed to actually make it. Now, while all that sounds fine on paper, there was one big issue right from the start, which was the fact that the majority of the Konami US staffers who were assigned to the project did not come from the same exact team that made Project Overkill or Broken Helix, but instead had cut their teeth on Bottom of the Ninth, which obviously meant the project was slow to start up, as the team had very little experience making action-adventure titles. This was something that was confirmed by Jason Lee Elliott on their website in no uncertain terms. The team itself had a lot of trouble when I came on board. Most of the team had only ever worked on sports games, so they had no idea how to make a 3D action platformer. The art team wasn't very cohesive and couldn't agree on a direction. The game had been in development for almost 2 years and had little to show. Personally, I discovered that my 3D skills had stagnated from lack of use, and I was struggling to hit the quality the others were achieving. I had been at the office almost every day for almost 3 years at this point, and was suffering from severe burnout, which didn't help. These issues with Castlevania Resurrection's development were of course not mentioned in any official guise, but before the Dreamcast was even released in the West, and before even the game itself was ever officially announced, trouble was already following the project, like a sinister veil of mist that preceded disaster. In November of 1998, IGN ran a story addressing rumors that the development of an unknown Castlevania title for Sega's upcoming console was already at risk of being cancelled. Let me say that again. This game was already rumored to be getting the axe before it was ever even announced. Now, anyway, the IGN piece gets right to the core issue. Konami's still unofficially announced Dreamcast version of Castlevania, allegedly dubbed Cancellation by Konami insiders, is experiencing difficulties. Not only that, but some reports state that there are significant problems with the development team, which has moved from Illinois to California, and that members of the group were unhappy and were planning to leave Konami. Then, in a rather rare occurrence, IGN were actually supplied a response from a Konami representative, who were quick to try to stomp out the fire while still very subtly dodging the game's actual existence. To set the record straight, one team member, a junior artist, has recently decided to leave KCEA's employment. The remaining members of the team he was a part of are all happily continuing to work for KCEA. All staff were given the choice to move or not. Konami fully paid for staff relocation from state to state. As part of that agreement, we asked staff to agree to repay the relocation monies should they leave the company within 1 year of relocation, a perfectly acceptable business practice. As for a project being dubbed Castlevania, certainly no insiders at Konami are saying this. Konami has never officially announced the development of the Dreamcast version of Castlevania. Then they proceeded to announce a Dreamcast version of Castlevania just a few months later. So at E3 1999, the Vampire Bat was fully out of the bag, as pretty much all the facts about Resurrection originally spawned from this event, which featured a playable demo. The main characters, the story, how it controlled, everything was out there. And to the average gamer, it probably all looked pretty sweet, bolstered by the fact that game magazines covered it throughout the summer. You'd see fancy screenshots and artwork of Sonya and Victor alongside other highly anticipated Dreamcast titles, like the home version of Soul Calibur, so those early nasty rumors were already being quickly forgotten. However, the remnants of those rumors were still having a ripple effect on the game's development. As per that Konami statement from earlier, there was the confirmation that team members in Chicago had to be relocated to the newly opened San Francisco office, which obviously caused delays and contributed to why it took Resurrection so long to really ramp up. With that in mind, after the Dreamcast was released that September, third-party companies that had in development DC titles started to get cold feet the longer they took to come out, as many within the industry realized that the console wasn't going to hit its already modest sales targets. But while that was certainly the biggest factor into Castlevania Resurrection's ultimate cancellation, it unfortunately wasn't the only one, because much like the Belmont lineage itself, and as Jason James Elliott stated, it did indeed seem like it was doomed from the very start. Even if the Dreamcast's disappointing sales numbers weren't a factor, the development hierarchy for Castlevania and many of the other KCEA-developed games was spread a little bit across both United States and Japan, as longtime Konami project manager Norio Takemoto was ultimately in charge of Resurrection's overall progress. And as we've covered in past episodes, cooperation between Japanese and Western studios, especially at this point in time, was difficult for a variety of reasons. Namely the obvious language barrier and just plain old logistics. There is yet another commonly cited reason that contributed to the game's cancellation, and that was the impending release of the PS2, which Sony had kept close to their chest for a long while. According to Resurrection's art director Greg Orduyan in an interview with the Castlevania Dungeon, the upcoming console changed Konami's plans in a very concrete and, to Sega, devastating way. The game was canceled the same day that Sony announced the PS2. The reality is, Sony was very secretive about the PS2. Then they said, okay, this is the definite date we're releasing the PS2. This did not affect just Castlevania, it affected every single DC game Konami was developing worldwide. But why cancel the game so decisively? If Konami wanted to suddenly change their bet and place it on another horse, why not just take what they had on the Dreamcast Dreamcast and port it over to the PS2. Well, in a follow-up question from the same Castlevania Dungeon interview, Greg explained this line of thinking in further detail. This goes to the intricacies of game development. If you want to port something, you need to plan it early in development. Otherwise, you would need to rewrite it. Sometimes it's easier to build from scratch than to retrofit. Now, a bit of a disclaimer. We don't have a whole lot more to go on than Greg Orduyan's opinions as to why the game was cancelled, as Jason Lee Elliott had no additional insight, as they had left the project a few months before its untimely fate. But combing through the Castlevania Dungeon interview, some of Orduyan's answers were vague and at times very deflective, constantly saying that everyone at Konami, both East and West, loved the demo they had put together, and that those early rumors of problems with Castlevania came from other jealous Konami employees that were trying to push an agenda? Listen, it's up to the viewer on how many grains of salt to take with his statements, but be aware, when he was asked, "What do you think of Ayami Kojima?" he responded with, "Nothing really. She's okay. She can draw." Yeah, jeez, okay, dude. Anyway, in March of 2000, Sony did share the proposed release date for the mighty PlayStation Double Ballin', and around that exact same time, Konami did indeed cancel Castlevania Resurrection, whereupon Koji Igarashi and the teams he was overseeing started development on a number of other CV titles, including Lament of Innocence. And unfortunately, since Resurrection was not resurrected, you knew that one was coming, for the PS2, it also meant a similar fate for the entire Konami San Francisco studio, which was especially egregious given they never even got to release a single game before they were whipped into an early grave. And it's about here where I usually wrap things up, but thankfully there's still a little bit more to the story. Over the years, Castlevania fans have proven to be some of the most passionate and dedicated of any fandom, extensively cataloging every detail and scrap of media on every single entry in the series, cancelled or not. So in April 2021, a YouTube channel popped up named CVR Exists, which obviously stood for Castlevania Resurrection Exists, and uploaded a video demoing an early slice of the game that contained enemies and hazards throughout 5 different stages, which could be explored by Sonia Belmont. This meant that someone out there had a working build of the game, and the entire CV fanbase held their collective breath to see if it would get dumped. They fortunately didn't have to wait long though, because just a few weeks later, the same build was all over the internet, and entirely playable through the wonders of modern Dreamcast emulation. While obviously unfinished and buggy, it's a fascinating relic of an age gone by, because while the original team sought to make a pretty straightforward linear action game without shaking up the formula too much, it's reasonable to say that this would have been a better way to introduce Castlevania to the world of polygons, as the N64 games were always considered, divisive. And unlike many other games I've covered in the past, it's great that fans are actually able to experience what could have been, proving that not every cancelled game has to die as a miserable little pile of secrets.
But enough talk! How about you?
And if you out there know of any other legendary tales of lost gaming development, let me know in the comments below, or enter the ornate and sometimes upside down castle that is my social media. See you next time, Vampire Slayers, and thanks for watching!